My 16-year-old grandson, Billy, was a curious one. Anything that ever popped into his head, he asked about. He was like a sponge, and I could not be more proud. If you ask me, I think this stemmed from his Boy Scout upbringing. His father was resistant to the idea, but all it took was a little bit of elbow grease and some persuasion to get him on board. I loved my time in the Boy Scouts out in Locust Grove. Heck, even met Billy's grandma around that area. She was a camp counselor at the time. Been married for 42 happy years since then. Anywho, in Oklahoma, there ain't much to do. You have fun by making fun. Always has been that way. So, Billy and I would do things outside. We would fish, hike, hunt. One day, while we were perched up on our lawn chairs, lakeside with our fishing poles in the canal, Billy turned to me and said, "Grandpa, tell me a story." Hey, what kind of story are we talking about here, Billy? Do you want a story about girls? About your daddy? No, Grandpa, I want something scary or exciting to tell the troop. All the guys have these awesome stories, and all I ever get to tell them about is the time I nabbed that whitetail last summer. As awesome as that might be for you and me, it doesn't hit with the guys. Give me something good for this summer to tell them. Please. Ha ha. Alright, Billy. You wanna hear the story about these Girl Scouts who were found dead when I was your age? Oh, wow. Darker than I expected, but yes, this'll get their attention. Lay it on me. I reached over into my red cooler and cracked open a wet can of PBR. I looked at Billy, who had curious eyes. Here, just the one. Don't tell your daddy, and don't go telling him about this story neither. The last thing I need is an earful from Billy Sr. because you're having nightmares, you hear? Promise, he said, with a joyful smile. So go ahead, tell me about the Girl Scouts. Well, Billy, it was the summer of '77. Out in Mays County, there were these 3 girls, about half your age, who were found dead at Camp Scott. Now, Billy, they weren't just dead. From what I heard, they were taken advantage of, if you catch my drift. Billy looked like a deer in headlights but nodded to acknowledge he understood. Now, the names were Lori, Michelle, and Doris. All cute as a button and innocent to all the demons in the world. But that night, the devil saw to it that he wanted these little girls and unleashed hellfire on them. They were beaten badly. Billy, police reports used words like bludgeoned and sodomized. Real tragedy it was. They caught the bastards who did this, right? Billy said with a bit of anger in his tone. Now slow your roll there, Billy. There's a lot more to this than meets the eye. So anywho, the girls were all put into sleeping bags and dragged about a football field's worth away from the camp. You probably think that's all she wrote, right? Some sickos decided that one night they were going to take the lives of 3 little girls in the name of God knows what. But oh no, Billy, there was much more than that. Hesitantly, Billy croaked out, Go on. Well, sure son. Delighted to. Enjoying that beer. I could tell Billy was still at that age where beer wasn't enjoyable yet, but he always wanted to impress. He cracked a slight smile and nodded, taking a forced sip of his PBR. Atta boy. Okay, so where were we now? Oh yes, right, okay. So anyway, the camp actually had a bit of a fuss the night before. Their counselor cabin looked like a tornado had passed through it. Papers and pencils and folders everywhere. Couldn't even see the ground. But there was one thing different. A note. Read something like, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in Tent 1. Don't go quoting me to your scout friends now, memory ain't what it used to be." But, moving along, the camp saw all this and just thought nothing of it. Just a prank. Grandpa, that's crazy. How could they think nothing of this? Billy, the 70s were a time when boys could be boys. It's just what we did. Now, do you want the rest of the story or what? We're burning daylight and your daddy won't be happy with me if I'm late with you again for supper. Sorry, Grandpa. Go ahead. He was such a good kid. I rustled his hair and gave him a pat on the shoulder. After a quick swig of beer, I got back to my story. So to answer your question from earlier, Billy, they have not caught the bastards who did it. The only thing they have is theory. Depending on who you ask, the boogeyman did it, or Sasquatch, might have been the camp counselors. The only thing they did do was put the blame on this fellow by the name of Gene Leroy Hart. He fits the profile, an escaped convict, in the clink for, you know, taking advantage of two women. Both pregnant, no less. Police had him as public enemy numero uno as soon as the story broke. Made too much sense. So it must have been him then, right? Well again, Billy, depends on who you ask. They did find some, male evidence on one of the pillowcases in the girls' cabin. But you gotta remember, this was 1977. Things weren't all fancy with the iPhones and lasers you all got now. So sure, this bastard fit the description, but there was no real way for us to know. Some called it the perfect crime. I finished my beer and reached for my second, gesturing to Billy if he needed another. Still working on this one. A quick chuckle, an opened can, and a swig later, we were back to story time. Now one of the mothers of the girls actually came forward about all this and said she thought there was a lady who might have been present during all of this. In 77, a woman doing something like this was unheard of, ungodly. Especially in the holy state of Oklahoma. But apparently, that DNA we were talking about earlier might have been from a woman. A lot of people dismiss that, but if you ask me, there's probably some truth to that. What makes you say that, Grandpa? Look, I ain't pretending to know the difference between an ass and a hole in the ground, but what I do know is this: women make men do some crazy things, Billy. Crazy things. If a man loves a woman hard enough, and that love burns bright enough, ain't nothing that man won't do for his woman. So a man meets a woman, and she decides she wants the man to kill 3 little girls. For what? Was that just her thing? What kind of woman and man would do such a thing? You see, Billy, that's the thing. We just don't know. Hell, we don't even know if they were a man and a woman yet. Who says they weren't your age? Madly in love, wild and free. Gotta imagine taking someone's life, as unholy as it may be, must be quite the thrill. Could you imagine the adrenaline? So it was someone my age. Holy shit. Hey, watch your mouth, Billy. The last thing I need is you cussing in front of your daddy. Geez, I'm sorry. Apology accepted, son. But Billy, like I've already said, we just don't know. Another part of the story said that it was 4 men that did this, none of them being the Gene Leroy Hart fella. This is a wild story, Grandpa, but what, Billy? I don't know. I was hoping for something a little scarier. The movies out nowadays are sending kids home crying. I mean, come on. Oh, you want scary, Billy? Yes, Grandpa. That was the whole point of this. I took it on the chin, pounded the rest of my beer, and with a smirk on my face, I finished my story. Before all your cell phones and your iPads, you could hear the crickets going at it in the middle of the night. So, of course, people could hear what was going on when it was, let's say, 1:30 in the morning. Well, a counselor hears some moaning going on loud enough that it wakes her up. She checked around the tents, thought nothing of it, and went back to sleep. About a half hour passes, a camper gets a flashlight shined in her face. She wakes up, checks out the tent, ain't nothing there. Another hour goes by, and a camper hears a little girl crying, croaking out just loudly enough to hear, "Mama, Mama." At this point, I got Billy on the ropes now. There are certain sounds that were made for ears of the ungodly. The sounds that were heard that night, Billy, were as ungodly as they come. There was a pop that would shake a pastor to his core. Blood soaked everything in that tent, a sight that would make the wicked smile. Billy looked like he was going to be ill. Okay, you made your point, Grandpa. God, that story is going to be a hit this summer. Glad to hear, Billy. How about you finish the beer and we head home for supper? Billy chugged his beer, or should I say attempted, and we packed our stuff up, loaded up the truck, and headed home. We pulled into the driveway, which was empty to our surprise. We walked in to see my beautiful wife cooking supper, house smelling of homemade chili. Did you all have a nice time? Sure did. Don't tell Billy Sr., but I gave Billy Jr. here his first beer. Nearly made him puke his lunch out. Stop it, Grandpa. I got up chuckling, rubbed his hair, and walked over to my wife to give her a kiss. Grandma, can I ask you something? Well, sure, hun. What's on your mind? How much would you say Grandpa loves you? Oh, Billy, there is nothing in this world I am more sure of than the simple fact that your grandpa's love burns bright for me. So bright that there is not one thing in this world he ain't doing for me. He can be rough around the edges, but you know, boys will be boys. Why do you ask, sweetie? Oh, you know, just curious. I guess I'm gonna go wash up for supper. And not a second more, Billy stumbled a bit out of his chair and rushed his way up to his room. You'd think the boy was Forrest Gump for a second. Now what's all that fuss about? Nothing, my darling. I just told Billy a beautiful story about what a man would do for the woman he loves the most. She smiled, and I kissed her on the forehead. I went upstairs to see Billy. He was on his computer. You know, one of these days you're gonna have to. Billy swung around in his chair, sweat pouring down his face. Grandpa, didn't Grandma work at Girl Scout camp when she was my age? Oh yes, Billy, that's how we met. Remember, summer of '77, best time of my life. We were young, wild, and crazy in love. I gotta tell you though, your grandma, quite the jealous type. I visited her this one time in July, all her little campers, and they were no older than 10 or so, were giving me googly eyes, laughing, and chuckling, and all. Your grandma ain't like that very much, and she didn't like the girls none too much either. Wah, what camp, Grandpa? Oh, it was some small little thing out in Mays County. Called it Camp Scott, long closed now. By this point, Billy could have been turned to stone. I put my index finger on the inside of my mouth, and flicked it on my cheek, making a loud pop. With a smile, I said to my grandson, Billy, I love your grandma very much. Ain't nothing I wouldn't do for her. Shucks, I hope his Boy Scout troop enjoys that one. This story is based on the true tragedy of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders.